Thank you. Welcome everyone to the House General and Housing Committee. Today is Wednesday, February 12th. And we are going to hear testimony from two people involved in housing development. One is from Summit Properties, who is going to testify remotely, and one who's here from O'Brien Brothers. Zeke, there you are. Thank you. Hi. We are going to introduce ourselves to you. Several members of the committee are sick, unfortunately, and a few others will be arriving, I hope, during your testimony. So why don't we introduce ourselves? Elizabeth, you want to start to him, and then
Hi, Zeke.
take it away.
I'm Elizabeth Burrows. I represent Windsor One, which is Heartland, West Windsor, and Windsor.
I'm Debbie Dolgan, and I represent St. Johnsbury, Concord, and Kirby.
I'm Tom Charlton. I represent Athens, Chester, Grafton, and Wyndham.
Joe Parsons, Groton, Newbury, and Thompson.
Which are all very beautiful.
Stunning.
Leonora Dodge, I represent the also very beautiful Essex town in the city of Essex Junction.
I'm Ashley Barley. I serve Fairfax and a majority of Georgia.
Hi, I'm Mark Mahali, Zeke, and I represent Callis and Plainfield and Marshfield. So would you care to state your name for the record and proceed with your testimony? And then I take it after testimony. Well, first of all, members of the committee will ask you questions as it occurs to them. But then after Evan Langfeld testifies, maybe you can both answer, or if questions will be answered by both of you, Evan, I'll have you introduce yourself for the record as well.
Yeah, I'm happy to start. Zeke Davison, I'm the COO of Summit Properties. We're the state's largest private developer and manager of affordable housing and mixed income communities. We're based in South Burlington, got our start in the 70s in Middlebury. We currently have under management about 1,400 units, about 1,000 of those have some affordability component to them, predominantly in Vermont, but we've got two communities in New Hampshire and one in upstate New York as well. Over the last 6 or 7 years, our focus has been on the development of low-income housing tax credit projects in Chittenden County. We did 2 in Winooski that we opened in 2019 and 2021. We opened 94 units in 2023 and 2023 and 2024 in Evans, O'Brien Farms, Hillside community. And the current project that we're doing is down in Middlebury, and it is the largest master planned development outside of Chittenden County in decades in the state. We just had a groundbreaking ceremony last week. We have a master plan approval of 254 units, and we're broken ground on 80 of them. 45 of those are for sale homes. A lot of those available through VHFA's middle income program, which, I think a big chunk of my testimony today is going to be a plug for that program. And then a low-income housing tax credit building that we're going to be closing on and starting construction in a couple months. That'll be open in the middle of 2026. So that was a very fast introduction to Summit Properties. I think the insight at the moment we have is doing a large-scale development outside of Chittenden County, piecing together all of the ARPA resources, building town infrastructure, and going through what is a complicated development process, soup to nuts. We have I think a really good insight into what the challenges and number issues, especially outside of Chittenden County, are right now. And some of those are things you're facing. I could go so many different directions from here, so please interrupt me when you do. I think the biggest insight from our project in Middlebury, and this is what I said at the groundbreaking last week. We had Governor Scott there, we had Senator Welch, the treasurer, Maura and Gus, was it is really, really hard to develop in Vermont. And it is really, really hard to develop in Vermont for a lot of reasons. And our project is a great example of what can be done when everybody is pulling the same oar. And that's like, when I say that, I mean from generational investments from VHFA and VHCB, a DRB that was totally on board and helpful. The town was a partner in applying for a ton of ARPA funding, you know, plus the fact that the ARPA funding existed. All of that happened, and we still were more than $2 million short on being able to do the first 80 units. And there just happened to be an extremely large employer in that rural town called Middlebury College, and they stepped up and made that gap. And so I think the takeaway is there's a lot of potential on how we figure out how to do development here in Vermont. But there's a lot of stuff in this project that's not replicable. Nobody's hoping for another ARPA bailout because of a pandemic, and there aren't a lot of big employers like Middlebury. So my takeaway and my lesson there is in everything we do and in everything you all do in your work, we are all holding up the mirror and looking at all of the decisions we're making through a perspective of, will this help us build new homes or not? The stat I gave at the groundbreaking was based on the 40,000 new home report that VHFA and ACCD put out. The town of Middlebury is 9,200 people. It's about 1.5% of the population of the state of Vermont. I think 1.5% of 40,000 homes is, I think it was 560. So that's Vermont, that's Middlebury's share, and it probably should be higher because they're in a shire town of a rural county. We're building half of those with enormous state investment and private employer investment. And every town around Vermont has to do the same thing without that massive investment if it's going to work. And so the goal here is that we are all sort of holding up the mirror as to what we can do to make the Vermont an easier place to develop. We've made a lot of progress on Act 250 over the last 2 sessions. Our project, because of what happened, it was the Homes Act, right? 2 sessions ago. We were exempt as a priority housing project in a smaller community from Act 250. That played a big role. And I would just say that in all of the, I know that from Let's Build Homes, and I think I'm going to see you all tomorrow in person, actually, at a joint session. Yeah. Infrastructure funding is a huge component of it. About 10% of the total cost of our project down in Middlebury, the first 80 units at least, was infrastructure. When we're building mixed income, affordable, we can't pass that along to the buyers. And when we're building market rate, it just takes, especially outside of Chittenden County, the price point we would need to sell those at is outside of the availability, the available income of people in that community, which is why it's, nothing ever gets built. That's why the project we're doing in Middlebury is of a generational opportunity. That's all to say, there's no like magic bullet here, right? There's no way we're going to build our way out of this unless it is regulatory reform, it's investment in infrastructure, it's an understanding from, it's a reduction in risk through elimination of appeal opportunities at the end of permitting processes. I mean, it is literally everything, and I can't quantify any of it for you, except to say our vacancy rate's the lowest in the country, our homelessness rate's the highest in the country. There's nowhere for anybody to live. We need Vermont Futures Project says we need 150,000 new residents just to serve the current economy, right? Like none of that's going to happen unless we're going to build homes for those people to live, and we're never going to build homes unless the pendulum swings significantly from the sort of regulated NIMBYism that has dominated the development process in Vermont for the last 50 years. So that's probably as good of a time to step off my soapbox and let Evan introduce himself or ask any specific questions. I think there's going to be more specific testimony tomorrow about some of the infrastructure opportunities and otherwise, but I think today is just, if I can do one thing, it's sort of express the we all need to, in every interaction, whether we're a DRB member, a citizen, a legislator, sort of say, how is what I'm doing going to result in net new units? And we should be thinking of every appropriation, every regulatory reform, all of that, and through that lens.
I think there are a few questions for you, Elizabeth.
Sure.
Thank you. We heard from, who was it? We heard from, what's his name? Jason Webster from Huntington Homes yesterday. And one of the things that caught me in what he had to say was that kind of the problem of having actual manpower or person power to execute the building. And he went through the history of 2008, there were builders in all sectors. And then when the crash occurred, it meant that the system was literally decimated, and that remaining 10% went to luxury home building, and that's where it stayed and has gotten worse since. And so I was wondering your take on the availability of actual workers to execute the projects that you work on.
Yeah, so our partners have universally said that their workforce is the number one reason that the number one cost driver for Vermont. I'll go, a couple different ways in this. One, Jason and Huntington Homes we're modularly building the 45 for sale homes, and Jason's doing it. So over the next 18 months, he's delivering 45 of his, a year and a half worth of capacity, I think for him is 110, 120 units. 45 of those are going to be on trucks down to Middlebury for our mixed income project through the middle income program. So I have heard him say that. I think he said a generation ago they could do 150 homes a year, and they're doing 75 now, and that's purely labor. It has nothing to do with demand, materials, anything. That's a pure labor issue. We don't have our staff isn't swinging the hammers, but all of our construction partners, again, universally say that's the greatest issue. I don't know. I think the Senate Economic Development and Housing Committee had Kurt Nazer from PC Construction in. I don't know if you all have, but he gave this presentation at the Vermont Developers Conference in November, and he gave this again to Senate Economic Development. PC Construction does projects all up and down the Eastern Seaboard, but they did an analysis of Maine, New Hampshire, and Vermont's construction industries, and like projects cost 10 to 15% more in Vermont. 10% of that is labor rates, right? Is what we have to pay in premium, because it was like a third or a quarter of the construction workers that are in New Hampshire. And 5% is our more stringent energy code. So I think labor is, the point of all of that is a long way of saying labor is the number one cost driver. I think we understand, as we are above our neighboring states, at least, which makes Vermont non-competitive to be a developer. And here we enter the vicious circle of we need the homes for people to come and work. We need to destigmatize the trades. We need to, emphasize trade schools, but each one of those is going to be a drop in a bucket until we're able to, over the course of a generation, figure out how we can have the young people going through school because their families moved here, because they had a home to move to, because there was a job their family could have, which is all dependent on housing.
Go ahead.
Hi Zeke, Reb Krasnow here. Good to see you.
Yeah.
I wanted to express my deep gratitude for all the work that you and your partners have done in South Burlington. and Evan as well. I'm gonna give him the deep gratitude. And that's one of the reasons I really wanted to have you guys in, because you all have done such an incredible job in my district, bringing so many units online, putting roofs over people's, heads, and really doing the work. And I'm so grateful. And I know that I think Evan might have some more specific proposals in his presentation, but just thank you again for your work. And South Burlington couldn't be more proud to have all of those new homes. Again, I'm sure if anyone ever wants to come visit, we have so many new units that went up just in the last year or so. And I'm just so grateful. So thanks for coming, and look forward to seeing you in person tomorrow.
Ashley.
Yeah.
Thank you, and thank you, Zeke, for coming. I have a few questions for you. What type of unit do you build the most? Is it single family units, multifamily units?
Yeah, in our 20-year history, 40-year history, but certainly over the last 20 or 30 years, it's been multifamily. We did a long stretch of doing independent senior living communities that were mixed income with affordable phases and modest market rate phases. This project down in Middlebury is the first time in a while that we've done single family for sale, and those are all in duplexes and townhome buildings to achieve the efficiency and the density we were going for. But yes, the for sale piece we're in the middle of, but it's relatively new to us.
And what's the average cost to you to build a unit? Like,
Yeah, that's the $500,000 question, I guess we should call it.
Yeah.
I'll do one step back. The affordable housing world is different, right? And the average, and I think you've heard this from Gus and Maura, the average total development cost of a unit of big A affordable housing is over $500,000 now.
Yeah.
And those average square footage and those are all rental apartments, right? These are studios, 1 beds, 2 beds, right? So that we're talking 700 square feet on average, probably for $500,000. You can once you get out, and that cost is driven by that 10 to 15% premium in Vermont, but it's also driven by a lot of internal affordable housing community policy choices that we make through the qualified allocation plan that VHFA uses to allocate tax credits. Talk about holding up the lens or holding up the mirror and seeing how we're doing. VHFA, to its eternal credit, is making some huge changes in its qualified allocation plan going forward to control costs. So hopefully our lack of competitiveness is going to diminish on the affordable housing side. But once you get out of that, you're still over $500,000 to build a modest townhome home. And if you're getting up into a 3-bedroom and you have to build all the infrastructure because it's in a new neighborhood, you're over $600,000.
great. And then just my last one. We had somebody come in here, and it's been a few individuals who've said that they feel like NIMBYism has gotten better. And I was shocked by that. I know in my community, that's not actually the case. That's not something we can exactly legislate, but do you have any ideas on how we can make that better?
Well, you can legislate it in some regards. You can remove appeal periods at the end of permitting. So that is one really meaningful way that we can. Part of Vermont's NIMBYism is that Act 250 originally gave a voice to anybody in areas where there wasn't real permitting process. There wasn't a democratic process. That was the only democratic process. That's just not true anymore. It's not relevant anymore. There's a robust democratic process to get to a building permit. So the legislation of NIMBYism needs to be addressed through appeals, right? That's number one. Number two, I tell this story about our Middlebury project. We did we did 2 public meetings before we started our permitting process. And in one of them, a woman got up. We had just presented our first plans. She said, which had a big multifamily building right on the street that this new neighborhood was being built back from. And she stood up and said, I live right across the street from where you're proposing to do that multifamily building. How many stories is that going to be? And, I said, oh boy, I know where this goes. prepared myself for the lashing. And we said, well, it's currently going to, the plan is 3 stories. And she slammed her hand on the table and said, it needs to be 4. Don't you know we're in a housing crisis? I think that kind of set the tone in Middlebury. And every time there was a DRB meeting, there was a select board meeting, employers came, the Addison County Economic Development Corp, and like everybody turned up and just said, we need this so badly. And we presented what we thought was the right way to do development. And every time somebody stood up to either object on something, they either decided not to because they realized the momentum the project had and the need the community had, or we had the classic, like today's NIMBYism version is, I know we need housing, but.
Yeah.
And I think people are starting to understand that the need for housing is overwhelming any of the but that people are following that with. So I do think we're making progress. The issue is it still only takes 10 people with that. So we're never gonna, so from a regulatory perspective, we really have to control the appeals process.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Zeke.
Are there, I know there's going to be more chance after the next testimony, but anything anyone wants to direct? Go ahead.
So I just wanted to clarify, you're saying that the Middlebury project is permitted for 254 units and that you have actually built 80 of them? And do you foresee any other potential issues with building the next, I don't do math live.
174,
Out of the
something like that. So that's a great question. So we started construction on the first 80. And in order to build those first 80, if you include what we're leveraging for, our low-income housing tax credits, we've received in a $50 million project over $30 million worth of subsidy to do that. So that today is the only way to do a project at scale in rural Vermont.
And that was to build the 80, the 30
That's to
million.
build the 80. We have
Today.
permitted final plat approval, not like building permits, but final plat approval on the subdivision and the whole plan for another 174 units. And as I sit today, I mean, there's no economic viability short of us being able to get really creative to keep building. And I think that in some ways, we're going to be building over the next 2 years, these first 80 units, year and a half. My hope is from a policy, from an appropriations perspective, talk about what it takes to build out infrastructure. We're in a place as a state 2 years from now that we can keep moving through the community on projects, but it's going to take an investment or at least a commitment to infrastructure. And we just have to bring down the cost of building units. And that is everything we've talked about: labor, energy code, the risk of appeals. I mean, it's the death by 1,000 cuts that we just can't. Incomes don't support it outside of Chittenden County to build at the cost it costs to build in Vermont.
Sorry, so I guess I'm trying to figure out, so those units are not, they're about to be built because and then are increasing costs like in materials and potentially also labor. Do you already have that figured out now? Or like have you bought all of the equipment and the materials and arrived at a, like a labor cost, and like, are we still at risk of not having those 80 built?
We are pretty insulated against risk for these first 80 units. The low-income housing tax credit building, so those 35 units are going to go under contract here in the next month or so, and we'll close on that fixed price contract. The beauty of using modular and using Jason, who I think you heard from yesterday, is he's not committing to a year and a half worth, but he's committing to 6 to 10 months worth, right? And we are feeling pretty comfortable through that process that we're going to be able to control the costs and find even some efficiencies as we start to work with them. So we are extremely confident about the first 80 units. But after that, there's today no path.
Thank you.
Wow.
See, just a couple of specific questions. Well, first of all, am I right in that one thing I'm hearing from you is in today's world, with all of the combination of materials prices and all the price factors that are pushing costs up north of $500,000, outside of Chittenden County, the market doesn't support construction because wages are too low and people can't afford the house. So one significant conclusion is we need subsidy in some form or another. Am I right in what I'm hearing from you?
Yes, it's unfeasible to ask the legislature to figure out how to fund, enough homes that we need. And so the legislature's task turns into how can we be creative on infrastructure investment, right?
Right.
And then you're putting it on developers to be creative in bringing down cost. And there's modular, there's a lot of other ways to think about that. But again, and I don't think anybody's suggesting this right now, we just need to know we're making policy trade-offs. The energy code is a big one. I mean, Evan might have better numbers on that than I do, but it's $10,000 to $15,000 extra per unit to build to Vermont's current energy code than it was on the last turn. So yes, the incomes will rise, hopefully faster than construction. And as we get creative and are able to build less expensively, maybe incomes will catch up. The delta is still pretty significant, but it's not insurmountable in a generation.
Do you happen to have built at all in communities that do not have zoning?
No. One thing, and I say this to kind of make a point, but it's also true. Since we're usually doing what the Act 250 statute calls a priority housing project, anytime somebody comes and says, would you consider doing a project here? I'll go to the state A&R planning atlas and see if it's in a designated area, right? Like a downtown or a core village or a neighborhood development area. And if it's not, we won't touch it because we'd be subject to Act 250. But so no, and one of the requirements for a priority housing project is that the town have professional modern zoning bylaws. So no, we don't do that because of the risk of Act 250.
Thank you. Any other questions before we have our next witness? With the understanding that Zeke's going to stay with us, right?
I'm happy to. Evan's a smart man, though. He can answer a lot of these questions too.
You want to come, Evan? You want to come and
Sure.
sit down? You heard the committee introduce itself. You want to introduce yourself, short record, and take it away.
Yep. So my name's, first of all, thank you for having me. My name's Evan Langfeld. I'm the president and CEO of O'Brien Brothers. We're a 67-year-old family-owned real estate development and management company in South Burlington. Like Zeke, we focus on both market rate as well as affordable housing. And Zeke stole my thunder a little bit, but back in the day, O'Brien Brothers actually were the largest private developer of affordable housing in the state. They were early adopter of affordable housing creation in the state of Vermont. A number of those properties have been sold off over the years, in most cases to nonprofit agencies. We have about 117, I believe, perpetually affordable units that we retained and we own and operate today. We also have a very active development division right now. We're currently developing O'Brien Farm in South Burlington, in which we actually did a collaboration with Zeke's company, Summit Properties, where they developed two multifamily buildings, mixed income, 94 units, I believe is the unit count between the two of them. In the meantime, immediately adjacent to that, we have about 270 residential units, market rate, and affordable housing units that are for sale product, single family townhomes, cottages. And the phase that we're currently in, which is 155 homes, it's Vermont's first 100% carbon-free, climate resilient neighborhood. You might have seen it in the news a year and a half ago when we launched it. It's called Hillside at O'Brien Farm, or Hillside East at O'Brien Farm, I should say.
I'm sorry, say again, those units are?
They're 100% carbon free, so there's no natural gas. All of the power that comes in is from a carbon free source. They all have rooftop solar. They all have backup battery systems within the homes, as well as an on-site microgrid battery station that we've now permitted and GMP will be building. They all have super tight exterior energy envelopes as well. So it's sort of a unique development concept that we're hoping to replicate over time.
Those are single family homes?
Those are single family and townhomes and cottages. Yep. So there's
What do they go for?
They range. There's the perpetually affordable ones are at I believe right around 320,000 for a 3 or 4 bedroom unit. The cottages are in the 600 range, right around there. Townhomes are in the 6s to low 7s. Single families start in the low 7s and go up from there. And, just to provide a little context as to where costs have gone, when we launched the first phase of Hillside in 2018, we were selling an 1,800 square foot, 3-bedroom, 2.5 bath duplex townhome, very nicely appointed. We were selling it at a market rate basis at 335,000. I can't even build that unit for that cost at this point. That's how much costs have ramped up over time. And it's due to a variety of factors. Obviously, we had COVID kind of come down and just warp everything, but the labor shortage has gotten exponentially worse. And so it is a little bit of a chicken and egg thing when we're talking about labor shortages, because the reason why there is a labor shortage probably most primarily has to do with the fact that we have a housing shortage. And the other aspect of that, and I know Zeke cited the Vermont Futures data, the average age of construction worker in Vermont is 49 years old, which is the oldest in the country for a construction worker. And just to provide a little perspective on that, a 49-year-old construction worker who's working outside 4 seasons a year in Vermont is exponentially older than 49. I used to work in the field. It's hard work. It's a bluebird day outside, but most days are not like this midwinter, and it just ages you. And so while we have a shortage right now, I'm very concerned about where we're going to be in 10 years, because we're going to go off a cliff based on our demographics. So I thought what I would do is highlight a couple things. Originally, I thought I was going to have 15 minutes, so I really tried to condense what I was going to say. But I thought what I'd do is kind of highlight a couple issues, and then maybe Zeke and I can maybe we just have a little bit of a roundtable discussion after you get done with your questions to me. A few items that I think are contributing to the regulatory challenges, which are leading to the cost of housing overall. The duration and duplicativeness of the permitting process is a major cause of that issue. Just to provide some context, the first phase of Hillside took 18 months to permit for 115 units. That combined both the City of South Burlington's Development Review Board process from sketch plan to final plat, as well as the Act 250 process. The second phase of it took 3 years in the midst of a housing crisis. Roughly 2.5 of that was city related, 6 months of it was Act 250 related. A lot of that overlaps though. A lot of the work that's actually 90% of the work that you go through at the city level is replicated at the Act 250 level. So the amount of work that you're doing at the Act 250 level actually isn't as much, because you've already basically been beat up at the city level to begin with. One thing I want to point out though is that not only does that have a real cost to the developer, which I don't think it's any secret, ends up being passed on to the consumer, whether it's a buyer or renter, but it's also tying up the whole review process. It's tying up the permitting process. It's slowing down every project if you have to sit in 3 years of Development Review Board hearings. And so it has sort of an exponential kind of compounding factor to it.
We've heard this kind of thing a lot. So a couple of questions. First of all, how much of this in your experience generally is state level permitting problems? Not just Act 250, but are there other state permitting processes that are problematic for you?
Well, on this, I would lump the state level issues sort of all into the Act 250 bucket, because A&R comes into that, all your stormwater, your wastewater, prime ag soils, everything sort of gets lumped into that Act 250 bucket, because you have to check all those boxes to receive your Act 250 permit. I would say it's a little bit in our experience, which is just, one data set, because of the extent of the local permitting process. Again, it sort of has meant that on the Act 250 level, if you've, kind of fought the battle for 3 years, the last 6 months just kind of becomes a rounding error. But there's a real cost to it. I mean, there's an actual, a zoning permit cost to it because we get hit with the max fee of 165,000, but then you get hit with the prime ag fees, and then there's redundancy to the impact fees. So on prime ag, between the two phases of the O'Brien Farm project, we paid about $600,000 to the ag department. And then on top of that, in the most recent phase, we also got dinged with a grassland birds impact fee of around $200,000. The irony of that issue is that the grassland birds that we were talking about were bobolinks. Bobolinks are neither rare, endangered, or native to Vermont, and they wouldn't be nesting in our fields if they are being actively farmed. So we're paying $600,000 to the ag department to mitigate the fact that it's farmland, but then because we're not farming it, we now have bobolinks nesting there, and then we're paying $200,000 to A&R. And meanwhile, we said, can we sit down and have a conference with A&R and ag and maybe talk this through, because it seems like double jeopardy. I don't know if you're aware of this, but ag and A&R don't always see eye to eye on things. So they said, nope, we decline to, and we'll move forward, and you get dinged twice. And, in the grand scheme of things, on a project of this scale, you make decisions daily, weekly, monthly, as to what to focus your time on, what's worth pushing back on, what's going to drag a project out, what battles to fight. And so as a developer, you oftentimes roll on certain things that from a principled standpoint, maybe you'd like to fight, but they have real costs, and those costs just add on to the cost of housing. So the duration, duplicativeness of permitting, that has to be.
Just a quick, so like on that, you're saying you had to pay a fine. I just want to maybe underline like,
Yeah.
or a fee, sorry. Does that actually take into account, like, if I'm just looking at, oh, but you're building 100 units, that's like 1 unit less. But is it costly beyond just the fee that you're paying because you've had to do all kinds of other legwork to arrive at that, and then you arrive at that ending conclusion? Like, does it?
Well, I would say that
I'm just saying that I don't.
total dollar cost is what you're asking.
Yeah, like the dollar cost of the, I don't know, the time or I don't know, Chair Mahali always brings up the expensive legal.
Yes.
Bills, et cetera. So like, is that where the real cost is? Because even that fine seems like something absorbable when you're looking at a big.
Yeah, well, I would say $800,000 is a lot of money. It's sort of regardless of the scale of the project. But yes, to kind of answer on a broader scale, there's a lot of legal fees. There are engineering fees that go into all of that. But then those are just 2 fees.
Yeah.
That's not even the Act 250 fee. So then you've got another $165,000 for the Act 250 processing fee. And then there's other impact fees. So then we're paying, and actually this is sort of my second point, which is that the impact fees, they add up over time. So there are state level fees, but then there are local municipal impact fees, which municipalities are allowed to charge. They are supposed to offset the actual impacts of a development. They have to be specific to it. But one instance, again, I don't mean to pick on South Burlington, but we do a lot of business there. So I can recite some of the facts. South Burlington 3 years ago passed an education impact fee. And the point of it was to say that, there's a calculation that you make as part of your Act 250 submission that says we project this amount of students based on the type of housing we're doing. So if it's single family and it's a 3-bedroom home, there's a calculation that says this is how many, student age kids are going to be living in these homes. And so it's going to impact that. And then you actually have to have the school district sign off on your application. But they assessed a per unit impact fee based on the amount of bedrooms. And it ranges from about $3,500 for a 1-bedroom up to $12,500 per unit for a 4-bedroom unit. And so if you multiply that times 155 3 to 4 bedroom units, those are real costs. And I think that I have a couple concerns there. One, again, it feels like the past decisions, probably decades of decisions that have been made to not move forward on expanding or renovating a school system is being pushed onto new housing development. And it's an easy decision to make for a council or select board, because your constituents, your voting constituents are not the folks that are paying the bill. And I also think it's a regressive approach, because when you think about the income levels of families, typically speaking, the larger the family, the lower the income. And so what you end up seeing is at the higher level of impact fee, you have folks at the lower level of the impact. And so at 12,500 for a 4-bedroom home, it's a regressive tax against low income folks. It's not obviously that, linear, but it does, I think it does impact a demographic that we're actually trying to persuade to live in the state, which is, workforce age folks that have kids that will, contribute to our society or our state going forward. And so I think it's problematic on a variety of fronts, but if for no other reason, it's adding a significant cost to the cost of new development, and it's sort of giving a pass to all the folks that are in these towns to begin with. So it is a little bit of a NIMBY tax.
Zeke, I don't know if you can hear me, did you have a question or a comment that you wanted to make?
Yeah, I was reacting to the question about, the A&R fee being $600,000, and that's something that can be kind of consumed into a 100-unit project, and we're losing one project. I think the hardest thing as a developer, whenever we're asked to quantify the impact of Act 250 or of some of the state regulatory work, is you're asking it of developers that are doing it, right? Like, we're making the choice. Well, generally we don't make the choice because of the risk, but Evan is doing it at a scale and in a place where incomes can support that. The real issue with those fees, with Act 250, with the appeal piece, is that there are probably 10 developers in this state, and you're looking at 2 of them that can take the pre-construction risk to plan a development that can actually make an impact in our housing crisis, right? And on the affordable side, it's pretty much us, Evernorth, CHT, and Cathedral Square. And on the non-affordable side, it's Evan and a handful of other Chittenden County developers. And so I think one thing we really need to understand is all the chilling effects that Vermont's regulatory land use process have. And one of them is that not only do projects not undertaken, but there literally aren't the developers here that have the pre-development risk tolerance and capital to figure out how to do developments. And so if we really are going to try to, it's like an all hands on deck moment, and we need people that are willing to do 10 to 50 units, right? Currently the state is doing hundreds of units plus, like Evans, or 9 units and less to stay out of Act 250. We need the 50 to 100 or 150 unit, so the 10 to 100 unit developers that are willing to do that. And that's who Act 250 and fees really choke out. That was my only, I'll give Evan all the time, but I wanted to make that one clear.
Yeah, and I actually, that sort of leads into my third point, which is on the appeals. I know Zeke touched on a little bit, but those costs and then the threat of appeals and the dragging out, listen, we are of a scale. If we're approaching a project, I don't mean to diminish the impact to us as a company or to the cost of housing when it gets passed on to the consumer when you deal with an appeal. But what it does is if you're a home builder that has 4, staff members, and you're looking to do a 6-lot subdivision, and you've got a neighbor that, is all of a sudden getting up in arms, you might just say, I'm not doing it because it's not worth my time. They're going to bleed me dry. I'm going to be mired in this process for the next 5 years. And that's 6 units that aren't being delivered. And while we can move forward with scale on projects, we can only do so many at any one point. And candidly, right now, we don't get any subsidies. These are all 100% privately funded, whether they're market rate or they're income restricted. We can only do so much at any one time. We only have so much capacity, but we also only have so much cash available to us. We have so many staff members available to us. So we can't be running 5, 6 projects across the state at any given moment. So if the state is going to move the needle, it has to be an all of the above approach to it. So we need the little guys, we need the mid-sized guys, and we need the big guys. And we need the for-profit income restricted folks, we need the nonprofit agencies doing that work. And then we also need the private developers that are doing a mix of it and aren't receiving subsidies that are moving forward on projects as well, like us. And just to give you a sense of that, on the income restricted units that we are building, we're losing a couple $100,000 per unit on them. And so that cost gets transferred to the other. I mean, in some respects, it hits the developer too, but the developer won't move forward on the project unless we're getting a certain return on an investment. I mean, we are a for-profit developer. If we can't pay our bills, we shut down and none of this works. So when a municipality passes an inclusionary zoning requirement, and, you know, in our case, we don't use low-income housing tax credits. It's not like we would never do it, but for the for-sale product, it doesn't work as well. And so, you know, it's just essentially being shouldered by the rest of the units. One other item on the duration and duplicativeness of the permitting process that I didn't mention is there are certain statutes that require when a development application, like a sketch plan or a preliminary plat permit application, is submitted. Once it is deemed complete, you have 120 days before it has to appear on an agenda that goes in front of a development review board. There is no time period. There's no statute requirement that says, you know, when I submit a development application, that the planning and zoning staff has to deem it complete or not complete. So there's no, it can just kind of sit in limbo for a period of time. And that can be, you know, a few weeks. It can also be months, and we've experienced months. And because there is, you know, basically it's just, how many times do I have to pick up the phone and call the planning and zoning office and say, hey, gently, can we please get a response on this? Because we're just sitting here. We have subcontractors lined up. We have engineers, we have lawyers. We're trying to move this forward. And there's no clear path to the end game of actually getting in front of a development review board for a review. So that's something to think about in terms of regulatory reform. And I will also say on that point, some of it is self-governing. If the planning and zoning staff are not, they don't have the proper amount of personnel, it might just be a logjam. They don't have the ability, they don't have the capacity to move forward on projects. But I will also say, if you have a city council or select board that is leaning anti-growth, they can also slow walk that process because they can not adequately fund their planning and zoning department. So I'm not saying it's all like some Machiavellian game here, but I do think that sometimes it is intentional that some municipalities don't adequately fund their planning and zoning office, which creates a logjam effect.
I don't know if you're gonna get to it in your presentation, but we've had these discussions, but can you talk a bit about what we did last year and where we could continue to do better in the bill that we passed, and where you'd like to see some changes if you've seen some situations? I know one where it was not clear, where you'd like to see some changes. Can you talk to the committee a little bit about some nibbling we could do to help with some of the things that you've seen play out that haven't worked quite right?
Got a whole list.
Oh, I knew you had this.
Well, you know, one of the things, and again, I can speak to personal experiences that we have. So in addition to our development, we own a couple hundred acres in Shelburne, immediately adjacent to the village. You might have seen recently in the news that we spent the last year negotiating a development agreement with the town of Shelburne to move forward on a large scale residential project. I mean, it is a project of scale, would be the biggest ever in Shelburne. It's also a massive conservation project as well. 60% of the 200 acres are going to be conserved in perpetuity. And it's also going to replicate the style of development that we're doing in South Burlington on the carbon-free nature of it, rooftop solar, backup batteries, et cetera. The reason why I bring it up is that in Act 47, as you probably recall, there's a provision that says if you have on-site municipal utility, on-site municipal wastewater and water available to you, you get a by right density of 5 units per acre. We have on-site wastewater and water. There's some lack of clarity in Act 47 as to the kind of definition of what that means. In our situation, we actually have a sewer main literally on our land in the city's right of way, or the town's right of way. And across the street, again, in the town's right of way, is the water main. when we went in front of the select board last, I believe it was April, so we're about 9-10 months into this process. It was actually during the time period where they were going through a re-ratification of their sewer service area anyway, so the timing made sense. They actually updated a couple lots that had been left out of the sewer service area, and we said, this is what we have. And their response was, okay, great, interesting. Would like to hear more about what you want to do, and we're not willing to cede our authority to the state to tell us what to do with our zoning laws. And this is not a knock on Shelburne or Shelburne Select Board, because I think the Shelburne Select Board went through a very thoughtful and logical approach and a very, very public approach. I mean, I don't know how many public meetings I've sat in or appeared in front of, spoken in front of over the last year, but where there are loopholes that are not completely clear as to what that means, it's either open for someone to exploit or the threat of someone to exploit. And so the select board was essentially put in a position, whether they supported the project or not, where they had to go through a kind of a public process as to whether this should apply. They also knew that there was the potential that we would say, no, this clearly applies because we have what the law says here. Luckily, they were dealing with a developer that wanted a collaborative approach. And so we said, okay, we'll go through this process with you. We will not fight you in the court. We're going to go through this process. We gave up a bunch of concessions, but that's a 10-month process to get to a point now where the select board has now agreed to the development agreement that we negotiated. Now we sit and wait, because the town is still updating their planning and zoning code to comply with Act 47. We're supposed to be done by now. It's likely to be done by June. It may not be. So we sit and wait for that zoning code to be done. Then we can submit a sketch plan application. And I'm of the assumption that we probably have, best case scenario, 18 to 24 months from the time we submit a sketch plan application before we will be fully permitted and have a shovel in the ground. And that's if we don't get appealed. And I'm already getting appealed, and I've already spent in excess of $20,000 on legal fees working through two neighbors who live in homes on O'Brien Brothers developed land, who don't want to look at other homes on O'Brien Brothers developed land. Things are moving nicely, but that's the thing that we deal with. And until we fix the appeal process, and that's just two neighbors, we'll probably deal with 15 of them by the time we're done. And that $25,000 would become $100,000, become $300,000. And then the extent of the project from the time you start the process to the time you can get a shovel in the ground to the time someone's actually living in a home is years off.
And I appreciate, so I obviously know the story, and this is an example of where we need to do better to make it easier for folks who are trying to get the work done and not continuing to stall this progress. So, anything that we can do, I have the appetite to look at those changes to make things right, where, you both are on the ground seeing what's working, what's not working. And that seems like something that we could definitely touch on. So thank you for bringing that example forward.
Yeah, and just a couple. So the definition of sewer service and water service areas, that's one piece. Buildable acreage is another one, because, while we're talking about a by right density, what does that actually mean? Because towns have the ability currently to then make certain requirements that are above and beyond what the state allows for. So you can have additional buffers, like in South Burlington. South Burlington claims jurisdiction over Class 3 wetlands. I don't know that there was a scientific process that they went through. I don't know if they engaged with any wetland engineers. I think they just decided to do it. And so now you've got an additional setback requirement on top of that, which removes a certain amount of buildable acreage. I know Williston currently is taking a different approach as to what your buildable acreage is. And so, the setback requirements, the wetland buffers, steep slopes, there's so much minutia that goes into this that I think the state has to say, if we are passing laws requiring certain density or we're trying to incentivize housing, we have to be really clear what we're saying and what the state's law mandates, because otherwise some towns might say, hey, great, we actually acknowledge that we have a housing crisis and we want to do our part. Shelburne is a good example of folks going through a difficult process and coming out the other end and acknowledging it. But that's not always going to be the case. And even in that case, we just spent a year going through that process, which is a year longer on the back end of receiving homes. So like I said, I can talk till I'm blue in the face here on housing. I'm happy to take kind of broader questions. I kind of prepared my presentation for 15 minutes because that's where kind of we originally were. Zeke and I work pretty closely together, like he said in the beginning of the conversation. So we're happy to be kind of counterpoint on certain pieces if we just want to open it up. I'll defer to the chair.
Well, first of all, do members of the committee have questions off the top of their heads they'd like to ask either of these gentlemen? I think, as you know, going from general concerns to specific legislation is a difficult, important, somewhat perilous trip. And we wouldn't mind your help. I think, obviously the problem lies at the local level and at the state level. It's not just Act 250. Well, it is maybe if you have Act 250 writ large, but we do have some influence over the state and some influence over local jurisdictions. I think we would really appreciate it if you'd be willing to put pen to paper and give us a bulleted list of very, very specific changes that you might make. That would be helpful to us.
I'm happy to
Submit that to the Magali, our assistant, and then she can provide it to the committee.
I'd be happy to. I have 10 bullet pointed items here with some specific language. One of the I think biggest issues, which we've touched on a little bit on the appeal process, it's too easy to file. Listen, there are legitimate reasons to appeal. I don't find that if it's legitimate for a person living in a house to appeal another person that wants to live in a house. To me, we're not talking about building a nickel mine in someone's backyard. We're talking about you having the unfortunate potential of looking at someone else's house from your house. And so I think we need to acknowledge that there's different levels of magnitude, but if the appellant has no real skin in the game, it's hard, that $25,000 that we've sunk into kind of warding off these two potential appellants so far. I don't know what their legal bills are, but I would say that they're certainly south of 5,000, and that disparity will grow over time. And so there has to be some requirement. We operate in the US under the American rule. The rest of the world doesn't operate under that. The rest of the world operates under the English rule, which is that if you lose the appeal, you're on the hook for everybody's legal fees. I'm not necessarily suggesting that we go that far because I think it would probably be too big of a change, but there has to be some level of, order of magnitude. And at very minimum, it needs to be settled swiftly because, time is money and time is also time that someone's not occupying their home.
Right.
But yeah, I have, there's also on the other side of the discussion with Act 47 on the sewer service area and water service, there's also, I think, a fear by some folks that, okay, if a developer makes the claim that they have this on site, the municipality acquiesces to it, well, then doesn't it mean that if the sewer's here, this site is served by it, they build out this, then all of a sudden the next parcel down here is automatically connected. So I think that there's trepidation by existing landowners or neighbors that this is just going to be a never-ending sprawl. And so my take would be one cleanup that would be in favor of folks that don't want to see, just constant expansion of home development is to simply say at the time that Act 47 was passed, existing infrastructure that was in place, that's the demarcation point. Anything beyond that, it would require that the municipality actually goes through a permitting process to expand those sewer service areas and water lines. And therefore, I think you would ease some of the anxiety by people that are showing up and opposing these projects simply because there's a lack of clarity. And I think that that's reasonable on their end too.
So what you're saying is the as of right concept would be limited to an area served now by existing infrastructure. And that we could provide that if we want to expand the infrastructure, then there would be a different process.
Yeah, then there would, a municipality would probably be bonding for the expansion, so it would go through some sort of public process. Or you would at least elect your select board who would be making those decisions. I think with the existing infrastructure that is in place prior to the passage of Act 47, folks didn't really know this was coming. So now we're saying, okay, we want to maximize the existing resources. We need housing. Let's put it in places where we have the infrastructure in place. But beyond that, let's let the community weigh in on whether we want to and whether the infrastructure investment is worth what we're getting on the back end of it. And I think that's totally reasonable. But the other piece of it, though, is, and I've said this publicly in Shelburne, zoning is not a static process. For instance, on that Shelburne parcel, it's zoned rural right now, which is 1 unit per 5 acres, which is kind of the default Vermont zoning code. It wasn't always that way. In 2008, it was zoned residential, which was 2 units per acre. And there was an O'Brien development that went up in the early 2000s to the immediate east of this parcel. In 2007, the company started, it was pre my time at the company, but the company started developing a parcel to the north. And the people that had moved into the first development cried foul and said, well, we don't want that, but we're going to make sure that O'Brien Brothers doesn't develop this. So a couple of people that were in that neighborhood got on the planning commission and rewrote the zoning rules to prohibit, first of all, it changed it from 2 units per acre to 1 unit per 5 acres, and then prohibited the tie-in from any residential uses on that site tying into the infrastructure. So I think, one, it's a good example of NIMBYism and some pretty good hypocrisy. But 2, it just demonstrates that zoning is not static. It does change over time, and there's a public process for changing it because times change, needs change.
And I'll put in one plug if you don't mind. I know you're probably trying to kick us out at 2, but you'll hear some of the infrastructure conversation tomorrow, and I think there's a lot of really good ideas on the table that'll be flowing through your committee about how the state and municipalities can work on infrastructure. So I'll save that one. If you zero down into the affordable housing community, which is where we do a lot of our work, and to be clear, that's talking about like 200 units a year across the state of our 7,000 unit a year need. So this is a small piece. The affordable housing community at VHFA's leadership is starting to take a hard look at how we use state and federal resources efficiently. And one of the opportunities in doing that is in a lot of their middle income projects. And you're going to see some appropriations, I think, come across your desk. They're going to be asking for more money. And some of this was in the Budget Adjustment Act, but for the revolving loan fund, VHFA's revolving loan fund, the missing middle home ownership program. These are programs that can create net new units at $100,000 to $150,000 in subsidy per unit, rather than every dollar in a big A affordable unit being subsidized $400,000 to $500,000 once you're leveraging out of state tax credits, but it's still a scarce resource. So as we as a community look through how do we build net new units and how do we use our appropriations dollars to do that, I think some of the middle income programs that VHFA is proposing is on a subsidized housing perspective, the way we build more units and the way we build workforce units, the types of units we need, because we have this gap right now between the custom home builders where we started here who can build $1 million homes and the big A affordable subsidized units. So, and again, I'm talking outside of Chittenden County for the most part. So I would say, I would encourage you all to focus on the middle income programs that VHFA is proposing. That's something the legislature is going to have to approve, and in a tough appropriations year, I get that too. But in our small piece of the community, that's how we maximize what we're doing.
Yeah, thank you.
Can I just make one more point on that?
Please, go ahead.
Yeah, on the infrastructure piece, it's interesting because if you rewound the clock, 30, 40 years, the infrastructure that is now almost exclusively funded by the private developer used to be funded by municipalities. So the streets, the sidewalks, the playgrounds, things like that used to be funded by municipalities. So it was spread across the broader populace, the ratepayers, because of the overall benefit. That's, for the most part, no longer the case. The private developer pays for it directly. So we're building streets, we're building sidewalks, we're building rec paths, we're building playgrounds. And in fact, on our South Burlington site, one of the conditions that the Development Review Board levied on us was to build a sidewalk that was actually not even on our site. It was off of our site and it was connecting to another road, but it was something that
Look at me.
the city didn't want to fund themselves. And they said, this is of a scale, just build it. And we said, well, this is kind of crossing the line here. But again, you make these choices along the way. So, it's a 3-year negotiation. We ended up not only building that, or we're building that $200,000 sidewalk, we also got appealed by a neighbor, again, off the site, who didn't want the sidewalk in front of their house, which we then spent $50,000 litigating and then screening, again, off of our site. And so there's all these factors that kind of come together. But in South Burlington, you can maybe manage the cost of that infrastructure. In Fairhaven, you will never see that development occur if the developer has to build that infrastructure. And so, I know the idea is floating around. I don't know whether it's realistic or not, but some sort of TIF district mechanism that's dedicated to residential uses, to me, just seems like a no-brainer in areas that you don't have the market that can support the cost of infrastructure.
Yes.
Can you give me a finite definition of infrastructure, please?
Yeah, I would say it's really anything so typically speaking, construction is divided into 2 buckets: vertical, which is, the built-in thing that you occupy, and horizontal. So a lot of times they'll also call it gray. And so, it's streets, it's the wastewater lines that come in, the water mains that come in, the sidewalks, the rec paths. I will even put into it amenities like, we built playgrounds on site. And again, some of those, they all make the community livable, but there is a tipping point because you have to manage that cost. And those costs are pretty massive.
Is electricity part of the infrastructure?
Yep. Yes.
So what I would like is a list of things that's finite, that is what you consider to be infrastructure.
Sure.
Because I keep hearing infrastructure over and over again, and some people seem to include only wastewater and water, and some people include a much bigger ball of wax. And I live in a rural area, and one of the things that my district is Heartland, West Windsor, and Windsor. And in Windsor, we have a former prison site that is a beautiful and pristine piece of property. It's 120 acres. You could do and it overlooks Mount Escutney, and it's perfect. You could do all kinds of things with it. And they're spending $250,000 a year to keep the lights on and water running. Which is, since 2017, when the prison shut down, is a lot of money that could have been spent on more meaningful things. But one of the things that always comes back to whenever a residential proposal is made is that the county road upon which that site sits is not of a grade that could support however many residences could be put in there. One of the things that people in environment farm town worry about is a proliferation of impervious ground cover, especially in a time when we are experiencing a rise in floods, so to speak. And so I want to know whether paving roads is considered to be part of the whole piece of infrastructure, and how can we, when we are seeing an increase in flooding, and we know why we have dirt roads, although the county road in Windsor is not a dirt road, but we know why we have dirt roads. What alternative do we have to requiring impervious ground cover?
Well, I mean, there is pervious asphalt which does allow for water filtration through it. It's incredibly expensive. So particularly for an actual road versus a driveway, I wouldn't necessarily recommend that as a solution. I do think that there oftentimes is a misnomer in terms of obviously there are areas that we need to stay away from for development because of flooding reasons, et cetera. I think oftentimes when people are pointing towards impervious situations where you have stormwater runoff issues, a lot of what they're pointing to is development that was done prior to the stormwater regulations that we've had for the last 20 years, and certainly that we've had for the last 5 and 10 years. And so, modern day stormwater practices in large part mitigate the stormwater runoff issues if they're done right. If you're working with a licensed engineer, which they'd be required to, and you would have to go through the Act 250 process. So you would have to check all those boxes. You're not going to be able to do a residential project of any scale, at least in my experience, that is served by a dirt road.
Yeah.
And so I don't know how to accurately answer, could you put a 15 unit subdivision on a dirt road? I guess it would probably depend upon the municipality. My assumption is they would say no.
My assumption is that they would say no too, but if paving the road is going to ultimately number one, cost the town more in upkeep, because we know the paved roads cost more than dirt roads in upkeep. And two, if that impervious ground cover is going to ultimately change the nature of the floodplain, I can see why towns like mine won't even go there.
Yeah, I mean, I think I can't comment specifically on it, but I would assume there are probably areas in your district that are probably better suited for development than others. And, if you're building a new well-designed road, there's catch basins. I mean, there's ways to move that stormwater, there's curbing. But yeah, I'm not an engineer, so I don't really know how to specifically answer it.
But anyway, going back to the question of infrastructure, is there a commonly held finite list of things that are considered to be infrastructure?
Yeah, I think we could provide a list of things that we assume are infrastructure. And I'd be happy to send that along when I send this along.
I really appreciate
Yeah,
it.
certainly.
Thank you.
I think that on, roads and the catch basins and everything to handle it would certainly be considered infrastructure. The question is who pays for it.
Right.
Have you used in any of your work assessment districts?
We have not done any assessment districts. I think I should say that there are is it Act 145, which is the traffic assessment district. So yes, on that front, but not on infrastructure. It's, other than traffic infrastructure.
Right. Zeke, I see you appeared. Do you have something you'd like to add?
Well, and I'm sorry, I don't remember all your names sitting around the table, but to the question about the dirt road leading to, a potential building site, I think it kind of underlines two challenges. One is none of the infrastructure proposals you hear will make sense unless there's a grand list value justification for it, right? And so that would be a calculation that developer would have to do together with the town. If developing that, justifies the cost and of that infrastructure, you'll hear more proposals how that happens tomorrow, but nobody's just paving stuff and hoping developers come, right? It comes together. The second piece is, I think that really underlines, nobody says we need to go out and develop every part of Vermont, right? And the tier 1, 2, 3 Act 250 piece last year was an attempt at that compromise. It's going to turn into a map drawing fight, which is unfortunate. But I think it really underlines in tier 1 areas, right, where we identify that there's town sewer and water. The town has identified that this is good for development. We have to really, really make it easy and incentivize people to build there. And that includes at times not just dense infill, right? Like we're not trying to get developers to remediate brownfields. We're not trying to get developers to eliminate blight. Like it's going to include greenfield development, and we all need to be okay with that and where we're drawing tier 1 maps. And I think there's been some hesitancy on people to be willing around town villages to do greenfield development. It is quite honestly what we're doing in Middlebury. This is a 9-acre hayfield that is immediately adjacent to the Shaw's Shopping Plaza, right? And so that we have to be willing to develop and accept that trade-off in the right places. And so I think where we say we're identifying development, we have to be liberal on what we're identifying and mapping that way, and then we have to really reduce the barriers to build there. It's the only way we're coming out of this.
Yeah, an interesting data point that I heard Kevin Chu from the Vermont Futures Project cite the other day was that, we all hear that we don't want Vermont to turn into New Jersey. We don't want this sprawl. Vermont has 70, my numbers might be slightly off by 1 or 2, but Vermont has about 70 people per square mile. New Jersey has 1,100 people per square mile. If we hit the Vermont Futures Project target of 802,000 people, we would be at 80 people per square mile, again, versus 1,100 people per square mile. So, we're an order of magnitude away from becoming New Jersey. And I think to Zeke's point, none of us live here because even us developers, we're not here to pay Vermont over, but we have to make sure our state is viable into the future. And there are ways to do so with nuance and do so in areas that should have development and that we can maximize existing infrastructure investment. And that's really what we're talking about. It's not paving over, the hills of Windsor. It's about saying we need to have viable communities that aren't just in Chittenden County. We need viable rural communities too. And we have to be delicate about how we do that, but we still need them to be viable.
I'll just close one thing and just speak to that too. I mean, the churn is real. So every time that you all build the hundreds of units literally across the street from my house that I've lived in for almost 20 years, then people are continuing to move. The seniors are able to leave and go into Zeke's unit. People like me are able to go across the street to yours. And so just again, thank you for continuing your perseverance and tenacity to deal with a lot of hoops. And you're always welcome to keep building in Chittenden 9.
Appreciate that. And for your support.
Franklin one is pretty great. Come down the road.
Other comments, questions? Thank you so much, both of you. Really appreciate your taking time away from doing what you do all day. Come here and be with us, talk to us. And I guess, Zeke, at least we'll see you tomorrow. We're having a joint hearing with House Commerce, taking a look at infrastructure, ideal ways of paying for infrastructure.
Great. Well, we appreciate all that you do, and thank you for inviting us here.
Sure.
Thank you.
So much. Both of you, thank you. So, members of the committee, we are going to leave this. And we're going to we have the floor at 3. Tomorrow, our first hearing, Thursday, H-169, which is about discrimination of public accommodations. We're just doing an introduction and walkthrough. And Inaro is the sponsor, and she will be introducing it along with Cameron Wood, who will be talking to us about it. And then at 1 o'clock, we have the joint committee hearings with Commerce about tax income. And that's our day tomorrow. Any final questions? We start at 10:45. And anything else?